On April 1st, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model stood at the window of his headquarters in Euler. Before him, a landscape of complete collapse unfolded. Endless columns of exhausted soldiers moved slowly. Charred tanks and abandoned guns littered the ground. The telephone on his desk had been silent for 2 days. Communication with Berlin was severed. Around his armies, the Allied ring tightened. Trapped inside were 300,000 German soldiers. They occupied a patch of land only 100 by 80 kilometres. This was the birth of the Ruhr Pocket, the largest encirclement of the Wehrmacht in Western Europe. Within 2 weeks, over 13,000 soldiers would lay down their arms. Hitler would later call this act treason. Historians would mark this moment as a point of no return. Model himself would take his own life 3 weeks later. He could not bear the weight of the German army's greatest disaster in the West. How did the heart of German industry become such a trap? Why did elite divisions surrender without a final battle? What did the soldiers feel as they realized the war was definitively lost? The Ruhr industrial region had long served as the backbone of the German war machine. Between the rivers Ruhr and Lippe, 65% of the Reich's coal and 80% of its steel were produced. The largest chemical and engineering plants operated here. Cities like Essen, Dortmund and Düsseldorf formed the foundation of the German war economy. The Allies understood this critical importance. In March 1945, they launched a series of devastating air raids. This operation was codenamed Clarion. On the night of the March 11th, more than 1,000 bombers dropped nearly 5,000 tons of bombs on Essen alone. Industry was weakened but continued to function. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower knew that as long as the Ruhr supplied metal and munitions, the war would persist. So, a direct plan was devised. Encircle the region, cut it off from the rest of Germany, and force a surrender without costly urban fighting. The task fell to the 12th and 9th US Armies, commanded by General Omar Bradley. On paper, German forces appeared formidable. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Model, numbered approximately 430,000 troops. But the reality was starkly different. Following the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the Wehrmacht had not recovered. Divisions were under strength, depots were half empty, and fuel was scarce. Young recruits, lacking training, were thrown into battle. Veterans were exhausted by years of war. On March the 23rd, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine. Within a week, they had secured bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The road to encircling the Ruhr was open. On the morning of March 25, 1945, Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 8th Airborne Corps, received orders to advance east from Wesel. His mission was to link up with the 1st US Army, advancing from the south, and close the ring around the Ruhr in the north. The 9th Army of General William Simpson had crossed the Rhine above Düsseldorf. Its strength comprised 8 infantry and 2 armoured divisions, totalling over 300,000 soldiers. They were supported by 2,500 tactical aircraft. German resistance proved weak. The 302nd Volksgrenadier Division, for instance, had only 4,200 soldiers instead of its nominal 10,000. By the evening of the March 26th, the 9th Army's spearheads had advanced 15 kilometres deep. This pace of advance surprised even seasoned officers. Captain James Collins of the 2nd Armoured Division recalled moving as if on parade. He noted that Germans retreated or surrendered in whole units, and organised resistance was almost non-existent. Simultaneously, from the south, the 1st Army of General Courtney Hodges advanced. It had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, where on March 7th, Americans had unexpectedly seized the Ludendorff Bridge. This bridgehead became a crucial springboard for the Ruhr encirclement. On March 28th, tanks of the 3rd Armoured Division stormed into Marburg, effectively cutting off the district from southern supply routes. The 9th Infantry Division followed, clearing scattered defenders. In Marburg, the Allies captured depots containing 50,000 tons of munitions. The Germans had no time to evacuate or destroy these supplies. Model recognised the scale of the danger. On March 27th, he telegraphed Hitler, requesting permission to retreat beyond the Ruhr. The reply came the next day: defend every metre to the last soldier. Retreat forbidden. This order sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Model, a professional officer since the First World War, understood the implications. Encirclement without fuel and air cover meant catastrophe. However, an order was an order. He began preparing his troops for a circular defence. On March 30th, American tanks reached Paderborn, a key railway hub 80 kilometres east of the Ruhr. Here, one of the fiercest battles of the entire operation erupted. The Panzer Grenadier Division, Westphalen, formed from tank school cadets, launched a counterattack. Young SS fanatics fought fiercely. The fighting lasted 2 days. The Americans lost 22 Shermans and over 100 men, yet Allied superiority was overwhelming. On April 1st, Paderborn fell. The path for the junction of the American armies lay wide open. April 1st in 45, 1600 hours, near the town of Lippstadt, 40 kilometres southeast of Paderborn, a symbolic meeting took place. A Sherman tank from the 3rd Armoured Division of the 1st Army halted before a vehicle from the 2nd Armoured Division of the 9th Army. The commanders stepped out and shook hands. The Ruhr Pocket was closed. Inside were Army Group B, under Field Marshal Model, elements of the 15th Army, remnants of armoured and infantry divisions, Volkssturm detachments, SS units and auxiliary formations. US intelligence estimates placed the number of encircled German soldiers at approximately 30,000. The encircled territory covered 8,000 square kilometres, an area smaller than Cyprus but larger than Luxembourg. Trapped within were industrial giants Dortmund, Essen, Bochum, Gelsenkirchen, Wuppertal. Alongside them were an estimated 4 million civilians. Model's headquarters were established in the Schloss Schnellenberg, near the town of Attendorn. There he convened a meeting of senior commanders. The atmosphere was tense. Lieutenant General Joseph Harp, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, reported, "Fuel for 3 days, ammunition for 1 week of heavy fighting, food for 10 days under strict rationing." Model asked bluntly if a breakout was possible. Chief of Staff Major General Karl Wagner answered honestly, no. The Allies dominated the skies, and their ground forces outnumbered the Germans many times over. Any attempt at concentration would be spotted and crushed by air power. The Field Marshal made a decision. Organise defence on the outer perimeter, turn cities into fortresses, conserve ammunition, and wait for a miracle, relief or a change of situation. It was an illusion, but he saw no other viable option. The US command acted with calculated method. General Bradley divided tasks. The 1st Army would attack from the south and west, the 9th from the north and east. The strategy was to divide the pocket into smaller sectors, isolate cities, and force garrisons to surrender separately. On April 2nd, the artillery preparation began. Thousands of guns battered German positions while aircraft struck roads and railways. In a single day, the Allies carried out wonderful sorties over the Ruhr. Lancasters and B-17s operated day and night. German flak fired accurately, but shells were desperately short. Soldiers in the pocket began to lose hope. Corporal Helmut Altner of the 116th Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We dug in on the outskirts of Bochum. Endless artillery blasts, the wail of bombs. The sky belongs to them. Our planes are gone. Food is almost finished. Officers order us to hold, but for what?" On April the 3rd, the Americans captured Hanover, cutting off the last routes of aid from the north. That same day, the Red Army began its assault on Vienna. The Reich was shrinking from all sides, and in the Ruhr, this reality was felt almost physically. On April 4th in 45, the 79th US Infantry Division approached Essen, the heart of German heavy industry. Here operated the Krupp conglomerate, producing cannons, tank turrets and submarines. Before the war, the city had 650,000 inhabitants. After the bombings, approximately 300,000 remained. Major General Ira T. Weich, the division's commander, anticipated fierce resistance. However, intelligence reported that the garrison consisted of only 5,000 soldiers, mostly Volkssturm, the elderly and teenagers. Their weapons were outdated, and ammunition was nearly gone. The battle for Essen lasted 4 days. Artillery systematically destroyed strong points. Infantry advanced block by block. Resistance was disorganized, comprising lone snipers, machine guns in basements, and occasional Panzerfaust shots. There was no central coordination. On April 7th, the mayor of Essen, Julius Kehr, approached the Americans with a proposal to surrender the city to protect civilians. The German commandant, Colonel Kurt Fischer, initially refused, but when American tanks rolled into the central square, he acknowledged the hopelessness and signed the capitulation. The Americans were stunned by the scale of destruction. Major John Eisenhower, unrelated to the general, wrote in his report, "The city looks like a lunar landscape. Intact buildings are rare. Factories are reduced to heaps of metal. People live in basements, starving. There is almost no resistance. They simply want this to end." Meanwhile, the Allies stormed Bochum, Dortmund, Gelsenkirchen, and Recklinghausen. The pattern of operations was consistent: artillery preparation, airstrikes, followed by tanks and infantry. Garrisons surrendered after a few days of fighting. On April the 10th, Dortmund fell. Its garrison numbered only 3,200 men, facing 15,000 Americans. Commandant Major General Erich Abraham surrendered with his staff when Sherman's appeared at the town hall. In Gelsenkirchen and Recklinghausen, the situation proved tougher. Remnants of the 116th Panzer Division held out here, veterans who had fought since 1940. They transformed every building into a firing point. The 35th US Infantry Division assaulted the cities for 8 days. Losses were relatively small, about 12 men per day, but psychologically exhausting. American officers noted that German snipers fought to the last bullet, fully aware of their inevitable fate. On April 15th, resistance in Gelsenkirchen and Recklinghausen finally broke. 1,047 soldiers surrendered. Approximately 400 were killed. Among the captives was Lieutenant General Gerhard Müller, the division's commander. During interrogation, he stated simply, "We fulfilled our order to the end. Now you may shoot us or send us to a camp, it makes no difference." By mid-April, the situation inside the pocket had become critical. Food supplies were exhausted, and military police increasingly recorded looting, even among their own soldiers. In villages between cities, residents hid their last provisions from starving troops, bricking up storerooms and burying sacks of flour in gardens. Field Marshal Modelli issued an order to requisition food from civilians. This caused open outrage. After years of war and bombings, many were already starving, and taking their last reserves meant condemning them to death. Some mayors refused to comply and were immediately arrested. On April 18th, in the village of Alter, a revolt broke out. A group of peasants attacked a depot, guarded by the Wehrmacht soldiers. Shooting erupted, resulting in the deaths of 3 civilians and 1 soldier. The next day, the Gestapo executed 5 men, labeling them saboteurs. In reality, they were local farmers simply attempting to survive. Desertion spread on a massive scale. Soldiers abandoned weapons, changed into civilian clothes, and hid in attics and basements. Military police patrolled roads, checked documents, and hanged deserters on poles with signs reading, "Traitor." In just 1 week, approximately 200 soldiers were executed, yet desertions continued. Commanders lost control of their units. Communications broke down daily. Radios ran on dying batteries. Telephone lines lay in ruins. Couriers died under fire or surrendered to the Americans. Headquarters no longer understood the real state of their troops. Reports arrived with hours or days of delay, or never arrived at all. On April 19th, 1945, not bombers, but aircraft with loudspeakers appeared over the Ruhr Pocket. The Allies had launched a massive psychological operation. Millions of leaflets rained from the skies. On the photographs, German prisoners were shown eating, smoking, and smiling. The caption was direct: "The war is lost, surrender and live." Within a single day, 6 million leaflets were scattered over the Ruhr. They covered roads, trenches, and rooftops. Wehrmacht soldiers picked them up, hid them in tunics, and read them secretly at night by candlelight. Officers ordered them destroyed, but the ban had no effect. The leaflets were passed hand to hand like a secret scrap of hope. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in German. "Comrades, Berlin is surrounded. Hitler hides in a bunker. Your families want you alive, not as dead heroes. Surrender. You will receive food, medical care, and return home after the war." The effect was powerful. First Lieutenant Hans Schultz of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division recalled, "After these broadcasts, the men began to ask, 'Why are we still fighting? What are we dying for?' Officers had no answer. Talk of miracle weapons convinced no one. In the eyes of the soldiers, only one desire was evident: we want to live. On April 20th, the Americans introduced new tactics. They announced safe corridors, routes along which German soldiers could approach without risk. On maps dropped from planes, red arrows marked the path to American lines. That same day, near Hagen, the first groups with white flags appeared. Initially, 37 men, then another 64, and by evening over 200. Captain Robert Murphy remembered them looking exhausted and hungry, yet relieved. One soldier said in English, "Thank you for not shooting, for us the war is over." Model attempted to halt the wave of surrenders. He ordered the execution of anyone who spoke of capitulation. Military tribunals passed hundreds of sentences for defeatist attitudes. But these executions only increased hatred toward the command. Soldiers understood they were being held in a trap and thrown into a senseless defense. On April 21st, American radio broadcast General Bradley's appeal to Model, "Your situation is hopeless. Continued resistance will only cause the deaths of soldiers and civilians. I offer honourable surrender with guarantees of life and adherence to the Geneva Convention. I await your answer by noon, April 22nd. The Field Marshal convened a council. For 3 hours, the argument raged. Lieutenant General Harp declared, "Soldiers are starving. Ammunition is nearly gone. To continue fighting is a crime." To this, S. Representative Obersturmführer Kurt Meyer replied, "Surrender is betrayal of the Führer. We are obliged to fight to the end." Model remained silent. He knew generals in Berlin had been executed for less. Yet he also saw the war was completely lost. He was trapped between an officer's honour and the futility of catastrophe. On April 22nd, the Allies began the final offensive. The objective was to split the pocket into small cells, depriving the Germans of any coordination. The First Army pushed from the south toward Hagen and Iserlohn. The Ninth Army advanced from the north toward Recklinghausen and Dinslaken. German defence crumbled. Some divisions literally dissolved. Soldiers simply went home or surrendered. Of the 8,400 men in the 9th Panzer Division, a little over 2,000 remained. The 116th Panzer Grenadier Division was at less than half strength. Many units existed only on paper. A telling episode occurred in Hagen. The 78th US Infantry Division reached the city in the morning. Reconnaissance reported up to 3,000 defenders. Major General Edwin Parker ordered an artillery preparation. 48 howitzers opened fire, but within an hour a delegation emerged from the city. The mayor, a Catholic priest, and 2 officers. They asked that the shelling stop. The commandant, Colonel Willibald Borchert, was ready to surrender Hagen to save civilian lives. The only condition was to allow the soldiers to give up in an orderly fashion, without humiliation. Parker agreed. At 1400 hours, 2,000 German soldiers assembled in the central square. They laid down their arms and formed into a column. Many wept, not from fear but from relief. One NCO told an American interpreter, "At last, this hell is over. Now I will be able to see my wife and children." Scenes like this repeated everywhere. On April 23rd, Iserlohn surrendered without a fight. On the 24th, Recklinghausen. On the 25th, Dinslaken. Most German commanders understood that continuing resistance merely to postpone the inevitable was pointless. There were exceptions. In the town of Witten, about 400 SS men from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend dug in. They were 17 to 19-year-old fanatics who still believed in victory to the end. Their commander, Sturmbannführer Hugo Krass, ordered them to fight to the last. The 95th US Infantry Division assaulted the town for 3 days. The SS used Panzerfausts, mines and snipers. Every house became a fortress. The Americans replied with heavy artillery and air power. Witten was reduced to ruins. On April 26th, the resistance was broken. Only 89 soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest were killed. Among the dead was Kraas. He was found with a pistol in his hand. Whether it was suicide or a bullet that struck him remains unknown. On April 27th, the Ruhr Pocket effectively ceased to exist. Only scattered groups remained, cut off from one another. Communications vanished. Each unit acted on its own, deciding whether to surrender or die. The overwhelming majority chose life. On April 28, 1945, Field Marshal Model's headquarters moved into a forest near the small town of Wenden. It could hardly be called a headquarters now, it was more a band of fugitives. Roughly 30 officers remained, a few vehicles, and a single radio transmitter, that had long since lost contact. Model understood the end was near. That evening he convened a final conference. Present were Chief of Staff Major General Karl Wagner, 5th Panzer Army Commander Joseph Harp, and a handful of other officers. The Field Marshal's words were brief. "Gentlemen, I release you from your oath. The army group has ceased to exist. The war is lost. Each of you must decide surrender or attempt to break out." After this, he asked his aide, Oberleutnant Heinrich Baer, to leave him alone. Baer remembered his commander's last words. "Tell my wife that I loved her. Tell my children to remember their father as a soldier, not a traitor." Model took out a Walther P-38, checked the magazine and set it on the table. That same night he wrote 2 letters, one to his family, the other to General Eisenhower. In the letter to Eisenhower, he explained that he could not personally capitulate as he had sworn an oath to the Führer. However, he ordered his subordinates to surrender to save lives. He asked that the Geneva Convention be observed for the prisoners. He signed and sealed the letters. In the morning of April 29th, Model walked into the forest carrying only the pistol. His aide followed, but Model ordered him to halt. 15 minutes later, a shot rang out. Baer ran toward the sound and found the Field Marshal beneath an oak, a bullet to the head, the pistol beside him. Soldiers buried him in an unmarked grave in the same forest. A week later, the Americans, guided by the local residents, found the burial site. Using documents, they identified the body and reinterred it at the military cemetery in Vossenack, where the grave remains to this day. Model's death became the symbol of the Ruhr Pocket's end. He had been a talented commander, halting Soviet offensives more than once at Zhev and Kursk. But now his professionalism and devotion to the army broke against the obvious truth. The war was lost, and further sacrifice was senseless. An officer's honour collided with catastrophe, and the Field Marshal chose death. On April 30th, the Allies officially announced the liquidation of the Ruhr Pocket. The operation was over. Only local mopping up remained, as small groups of soldiers still hid in forests and cellars. Over the following week, most of them laid down their arms. Counting the prisoners took several weeks. The American administration created special camps where soldiers were registered, photographed, had their documents checked and were sorted by rank and unit. The official statistics are striking. From April 1st to April 18th in 45, within the Ruhr Pocket, 117,000 German servicemen surrendered. Among them were 24 generals, 347 staff officers, and more than 7,000 field-grade officers, along with about 38,000 NCOs. The rest were enlisted men. Among the captured generals were the 15th Army Commander, Colonel General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, Commander of the Parachute Army General der Flieger, Alfred Schlemm, Commander of the 116th Panzer Division, Lieutenant General Gerhard Müller, and Commander of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, Major General Walter Denkert. All surrendered without resistance, some even with relief. The Allies also captured enormous material. A report of the 12th Army Group under General Bradley, dated April 25th, recorded 742 tanks, mostly Panzer 44s and Panthers, as well as a few Tigers. Also captured were 1,000 self-propelled guns, 394 armoured personnel carriers, more than 1,000 artillery pieces of calibers from 75 to 210 mm, and 83 rocket launchers. Additionally, 28 railway guns, 47 300 cars and trucks, over 1,200 motorcycles, about 700 prime movers, and more than 12,000 horses were captured. Material included 94 ammunition depots, 176 fuel depots, 23 field hospitals, and 67 large radio stations. Yet most of the equipment was unusable: tanks without fuel, guns without shells, vehicles without wheels. According to the trophy team's estimates, only about 15% of the captured armaments were truly combat ready. The rest were scrap metal or required major overhaul. German losses were also significant. Approximately 10,000 soldiers were killed. Exact figures are unknown, as many bodies remained under the rubble. 14th 820 wounded were admitted to American hospitals. Missing were estimated between 30,000 and 50,000, mostly deserters who disappeared among civilians. Allied losses were surprisingly small. For the entire period of encirclement, 2 were killed, 8 of 39 wounded, and 4 missing. The loss ratio stood at 1-4 in favour of the Americans. This outcome was explained by complete air superiority, German shortages of ammunition, and a profound collapse in morale. Civilian losses were the hardest to count. By rough estimates, about 1,000 residents of the Ruhr region died during the April and 45 fighting and bombings. Thousands were wounded, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. The Americans faced a colossal logistical dilemma: where to house 13,000 prisoners. Existing camps were designed for far smaller contingents, so improvisation was necessary. Alongside permanent camps, temporary open-air cities appeared. Meadows fenced with barbed wire where Germans lived under the sky, or in tents. The largest such camp was organised near Tremagen. The area was about 4 square kilometres. The contingent was 86,000 prisoners of war. There were no barracks, only tents supplied by the Red Cross and the British Army. Food was provided once a day, a standard ration pack, canned meat, hardtack, and water. Sanitation at first was dreadful. 200 field latrines for tens of thousands of people. With bitter irony, the Germans called these enclosures the Rhine Meadows. Along the river stretched endless rows of tents. These conditions triggered a wave of disease: dysentery, pneumonia, and exhaustion. US Army medics could not keep up with the stream of the sick. In the first 2 weeks, about 200 prisoners died. The International Red Cross insisted on immediate improvements. By mid-May, the situation stabilised. More medicine and staff arrived. Rations increased. Full sanitary blocks and isolation units were deployed. Mortality dropped to 5 to 7 persons per day among 86,000, a rate acceptable for such a mass in field conditions. Interrogations of prisoners gave predictable answers to the question, "Why did you surrender en masse?" Corporal Klaus Wiemer, 272nd Infantry Division, stated, "We were starving, freezing, had no ammunition. Officers told us to hold, but they no longer believed it themselves. The leaflets promised food and life. We chose to live." Sergeant Fritz Schmidt, 9th Panzer Division, said, "After the death of Field Marshal Model, it became clear. The end. Commanders lost control. Each man decided for himself. We laid down arms and went to the Americans. They did not beat us. They fed us. That is better than dying for nothing." Lieutenant Helmut Stein, 116th Panzer Grenadier, offered, "I saw Russia. I saw the ruins of our cities after bombings, and I understood Germany had lost. To continue meant to die for a mad Führer in a bunker. I chose life for the sake of my family." US Army psychologists summarized the conclusion: after the encirclement in the pocket, Wehrmacht soldiers lost faith completely in victory, in leadership, and in ideology. Most wanted only one thing: to survive the war and return home. Rhetoric about miracle weapons and final victory no longer worked. When confirmed reports of the mass capitulation in the Ruhr reached Berlin, Hitler exploded in fury. On April 21st, at a bunker conference, he accused Field Marshal Model of treason. Chief of the OKW Operations Staff, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, tried to explain. It was not betrayal, but an unavoidable military catastrophe. The Führer refused to listen. The order was given: find Model, try him by military tribunal, and execute him. When a week later news arrived of his suicide, Hitler snapped, "Coward! A true German officer does not shoot himself, he fights to the end." This remark would later appear in Jodl's post-war accounts. The propaganda machine tried to mask the scale of the defeat. On April 23rd, official bulletins spoke of heavy fighting in the Ruhr region, heroic, resistance and temporary difficulties, not a word of encirclement and surrender. But rumours spread instantly. German citizens heard the truth from Allied broadcasts. German-language programmes of the BBC reported, 317,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr. The war is lost. Hitler is leading the country to ruin. Surrender. Save your life. Millions secretly listened, despite the ban and threat of execution. Joseph Goebbels tried a counterattack. On April 25th, he declared on the radio, "The defeat in the West is temporary. A new weapon is ready. The offensive will begin any moment. Victory will be ours." But even loyal supporters no longer believed. In the Wehrmacht, the Ruhr disaster caused shock. Officers admitted that if hundreds of thousands surrendered without prolonged battles, what would stop other formations from doing the same? Morale collapsed. Inspector General of the Army Heinz Guderian told Jodl, "The Ruhr is the beginning of the end. From here, it will only get worse." On April 28th, Hitler signed an order creating the field tribunals with the right of immediate execution for surrender, desertion, and defeatist moods. In the next 10 days, about 100 soldiers were executed, but it did not halt the avalanche of capitulations. Soldiers surrendered first by hundreds, then by thousands. The Ruhr defeat accelerated the army's collapse. If before many were held back by fear of supposed Allied cruelty, now everyone saw the prisoners were alive, fed and treated under the rules. Fear was replaced by hope. The Ruhr operation became a classic example of an encirclement battle in modern warfare. American and British staffs dissected it as a model of how to trap a large enemy force with minimal losses of their own. Several key factors drove success. First, absolute air supremacy. The Allies had thousands of aircraft against the pitiful remnants of the Luftwaffe. Any German attempt to concentrate forces or supply lines was blocked from the sky. Constant aerial presence also weighed heavily on morale. Second, superiority on the ground and in logistics. Formally, at the start of the encirclement, there were about 400,000 American and 430,000 German troops. But real combat capability was incomparable. The US had full depots of ammunition, fuel, food and steady reinforcements. The Wehrmacht faced critical shortages of everything. Third, refined logistics. The Allies applied lessons from earlier campaigns. Frontline units received ammunition and fuel rapidly. Wounded were evacuated quickly by ambulance and aircraft. Equipment was repaired on site by mobile brigades. The system ran without disruption, sustaining a high operational tempo. Fourth, deliberate psychological operations. Leaflets, broadcasts, and clear guarantees of humane treatment undermined resistance as effectively as artillery. Soldiers saw a legal path to survival. Fifth, fatal German leadership decisions. The ban on retreat doomed the force to encirclement. Model obeyed orders knowing their futility. The absence of a realistic breakout plan, command chaos, and exhaustion of resources made defeat inevitable. British military historian Basil Liddell Hart called the Ruhr the perfect encirclement. In his history of the Second World War, he noted that the Americans demonstrated a model of destroying a large enemy force by combining speed, firepower, psychological pressure, and logistical excellence. A scheme studied for decades in military academies. Soviet commanders also analysed the operation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov wrote in his memoirs that the Ruhr Pocket exposed the weakness of German defences in the West, while the Allies acted decisively and professionally, preferring siege and psychological collapse over frontal assaults, typical of the Soviet school in certain directions. For the Wehrmacht, the Ruhr became a symbol of collapse, the loss of 317,000 men in a matter of weeks, without a serious breakout attempt, shattered the myth of invincibility. Soldiers and officers saw that if even the elite surrendered en masse, the slogan of "fight to the end" was an empty phrase. Behind dry figures and statistics stand people. Each of the 318,000 prisoners had a personal story, a path into the pocket and a decision to lay down arms. Corporal Hans Kirchner, born in 1922 in a Bavarian village, was drafted in 1941. He fought in Russia, was wounded near Kursk, but in 1944 returned to the front. He found himself in the Ruhr Pocket with the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division. He surrendered to the Americans on April 12th near Essen. In the camp, he fell gravely ill with pneumonia, yet survived. In 1946, he returned home and worked as a farmer. He died in 1998, never speaking to his grandchildren about the war. Lieutenant Werner Holtz, born in 1920 in Berlin to a professor's family, was educated and fluent in 3 languages. He served in the 116th Panzer Division, commanding a platoon of Panthers. His tank was knocked out, but the crew survived. He surrendered on April 18th. In the camp, he taught English to prisoners. After the war, he worked as a translator for the Allies, later as a teacher. In 1962, he published the memoir The Last Days of the Ruhr. He died in 1989, a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Sergeant Karl Weber, born in 1918 in the Ruhr, a coal miner drafted in 1939. He went through Poland, France and the Eastern Front. Wounded 3 times, twice awarded the Iron Cross. In the pocket, he commanded a machine gun team. He surrendered on April the 14th when ammunition and rations ran out. In 1946, he returned to his wife and children and worked rebuilding the mines. He never said whether he considered capitulation the right decision. He died in 1982 of lung cancer, a miner's disease. SS Sturmbannführer Hans Kemmler, born in 1915 in Munich, was a member of the NSDAP since 1933. A fanatical supporter of the regime, he fought with the Hitler Jugend division. He refused to surrender, urging fighting to the death. On April 16th, he was wounded and captured unconscious. In the camp, he tried to organize underground resistance. For this, he was put in solitary confinement. In 1946, he was sentenced to 15 years for war crimes. He died in Landsberg prison in 1953 of a heart attack. Medic Friedrich Meyer, born in 1925 in Hamburg, was the youngest of 4 brothers. The 3 elder ones were killed in the war. Drafted in 1943, he completed medical training. In the pocket, he served in a field hospital, saving the wounded under fire. On April 11th, the hospital was captured by the Americans, but Meyer continued treating both his own and the enemy. In 1945, he was released for humanitarian service. He later became a physician, worked with the Red Cross, and travelled to conflict zones. He died in 2011 at the age of 86. His obituary read, "A man who saved lives when others were taking them." Lieutenant General Joseph Harp, born in 1887 in Prussia, a professional soldier since the Kaiser's army. In the First World War, he served in the trenches. In the Second, he commanded the 5th Panzer Army. In the Ruhr, he advised Model to capitulate to save the troops. He surrendered on April 21st with his staff. In interrogation, he cooperated, describing Wehrmacht strategy. Released in 1948, he wrote articles about the mistakes of German command. He died in 1968 and was buried in a military cemetery. Private Ludwig Schmitz, born in 1927 in Cologne, drafted at 17. After 3 weeks of training, he was sent to the Ruhr. He never fired a shot. On April 2nd, on the first day of the encirclement, he surrendered with a group of boys just like him. The Americans were astonished. "You're soldiers? You're children." After the war, he finished school and university and became a history teacher. He told his pupils, "War is not heroism, it is fear, hunger and death. I live because I refuse to be a foolish hero." Each of these stories is a drop in the ocean of war, yet from such drops, real history is made. 317,000 men in the Ruhr Pocket. That is not just a number in a bulletin. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Some died in camps, some returned home. Some never forgave themselves for surrender, and for others, it was the wisest decision of their lives. The loss of the Ruhr industrial region proved fatal for the Third Reich. By April of 1945, the region supplied about 60% of coal, half of pig iron, and up to 70% of steel on which the war economy depended. After the encirclement and Allied capture, production essentially stopped. Minister of Armaments and Munitions Albert Speer sent Hitler a memorandum on April 15th. It stated, "The loss of the Ruhr makes continuing the war impossible from an industrial standpoint. Ammunition output will fall by 80% within a month. Repair of tanks and aircraft will become impossible. The army will be unable to fight for lack of means." The Führer read it and dismissed Speer without a decision. He still lived in a world where miracle weapons and fanatical will would overcome the enemy's material superiority. Reality was ruthless. By April 20th, tank production had fallen from 300 machines per month to roughly 40. Aircraft from some 200 to 150.